بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. محاضرة اليوم بعنوان الاتجاهات والحركات الأدبية في الشعر الإنجليزي الحديث لطلبة المرحلة الرابعة، يلقيها المدرس خالد قيس عبد، جامعة الأنبار، كلية التربية للعلوم الإنسانية، قسم اللغة الإنجليزية. Good morning, dear students. Today's lecture is going to give you an introduction to the main trends and literary movements in the modern poetry. First of all, we need to have a background about the factors with reference to the last lecture we delivered about the critical introduction to the modern poetry. First of all, the modern poetry, the poetry and the modern scene. The first half of the 20th century was an extraordinary creativity and originality in poetry. It opened with the sense of skepticism and uncertainty, two prevailing factors that accompany the times all along. The war of 1914 to 1918, the First World War, impaired the England of Edward VII, reigned from 1901 to 1910, and the start of George V's reign seemed a pendant period of post-Victorian era. Those years were rich in good writing of many kinds, old and new, major and minor, but established dominant masters and modes. In addition, the early 20th century saw the rise of many new poetic movements, which can also be considered isms, like Imagism and Objectivism. The best contemporary poetry, wrote Thomas Terence Eliot, you know him, can give us a feeling of excitement and a sense of fulfillment different from any sentiment aroused even by very much greater poetry of a past age. These opinions reflect the need and the vision of those poets, and how do they understand poetry, what is the task of the poet, and what is the mission of the art of poetry during the first half of the 20th century. Another opinion, William Butler Yeats discovered in his own search for the formula of popular poetry in the 20th century, true folk poetry delights in rhythmical animation, in idiom, in images, in words full of far-off suggestion. The idea of poetry that ought to be popular is diluted elixir of a later age, which has never sold to the masses. Another poet, Wallace Stevens, he says that most of the poem consists of rules or theories on what modern poetry must be. He writes, in short, it must be new, it must be grounded in real places, people, and events, and not shy away from unpleasant subjects. Modern poetry must be intently focused on the acts of the mind itself, and must give people a way to find satisfaction in their lives. The poem begins with one of these direct definitions of modern poetry. It is the poem of the mind, in the act of finding what will suffice. Thus, instead of merely repeating established forms, poetry has to adapt to a new world. It means that the old traditions are no longer fulfilling the needs of the readers. So he looks for a new world with a new type of poetry. That is why from time to time we have a new ism, a new trend, and a new movement. Why? Because the current time of poetry writing needs a new trend, a new form, new art of poetry to fulfill the needs of the readers and to convey the messages and the implications they are longing for. The first movement, Imagism. It is one of the prevailing movements so far as poetry is concerned. As a given movement, Imagism represents a reaction against the weakest sort of romantic poetry, where the poet might indulge his or her imagination in a verbose expression of personal fantasies. It reveals a desire to get back to the object which is there in the world. Once more, the real significance of Imagism is that it represents the start of modern poetry finding ways of expressing a sense of a puzzling and fragmented world, referring to the modern world, of course. The deliberate small scale of images poem suggests that the reality can only be apprehended in isolated glimpses, and then only directly through an images as opposed to any sort of logical analysis. In addition, the main rules of Imagism as a literary school concerning poetry, poetry evokes pictures or images for the reader. Direct presentation of images or word pictures. So the poem, when you read it, it is something like a picture drawn in your mind. This is an imagistic poem. Word choice is specific. No wider use of poetic diction employed in writing imagistic poems. Adjectives are used to enhance the specificity of word choice, but they are not overused. Attempt to freeze a single moment, so far as time is concerned. Attempt to freeze a single moment in time and capture the emotions of that moment. Imagist poetry often reflects influences of haiku or tanka. You know these two terms? They are special types of poems, are from Japanese origin, consisting of a poem consisting of 3 lines of, selected rhyme pattern and syllables, 17 syllables, 5 in the first line, 7 in the second, and 5 in the last, and so forth, with the slight modifications, and tanka, another term. The second movement is Surrealism. Those two figures are, advocates of this movement, André Breton and Sigmund Freud. This image is a surrealistic image. It is portrayed by Salvador Dali, entitled Persistence of Memory in 1931. It is painted with oil on canvas with this measure, and now it is, put in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. The word surreal means above reality. This is the meaning of the word. Surreal means above reality. In other words, the artist believed that there was an element of truth which is revealed by our subconscious minds, which superseded the reality of our everyday consciousness. Surrealism is a cultural movement and artistic style that was founded in 1924 by André Breton. Surrealism style uses visual imagery from the subconscious mind to create art without the intention of logical comprehensibility. This is the distinctive feature of this movement. The movement was begun primarily in Europe, centered in Paris, and attracted many of the members of the Dada or Dadaism community, influenced by the psychoanalytical work of Freud and Carl Jung. There are similarities between the Surrealist movement and the Symbolist movement of the late 19th century. There is certain similarity between these two movements, Surrealism and Symbolism. Some of the greatest artists of the 20th century became involved in the Surrealist movement, and the group included Weston Hugh Auden, Dylan Thomas, Ted Hughes, Robert Bly, Allen Ginsberg, Salvador Dali, René Magritte, and many others. The Surrealist movement eventually spread across the globe and has influenced artistic endeavors from painting and sculpture to pop music and film directing. The third movement, Symbolism. Symbolism is a major literary movement of the 19th century based in France. It is often associated with other labels: decadence, aestheticism, neo-romanticism, hereticism, modernism, and imagism. It is the usage of literary historians. Symbolism designates specifically a group of French writers, which included Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud, and Paul Verlaine. Symbolism is the practice of art using an object or a word to represent an abstract idea, an action, person, place, word, or object can all have a symbolic meaning. If you recall with me, many titles, characters, and things, even sometimes animals, when we appreciate them, we say that they imply a symbolic value. What is that value? It is something that is put behind the literal meaning, which stands for the existence of that thing or object for its own right. For example, the river. You know river, we all know what is river. River is a symbol of life, for example. Right? Or maybe it is a symbol of renewity, for example, or a symbol of nature. But in the result, it is an object, it is, you see, a water passage standing for its own right. A river is a literal meaning. What we are behind is its meaning that lies after the literal meaning. That is the symbolic significance. Dove, for example, you know it is a kind of bird. Literal meaning, kind of bird. But what is behind is that it is a symbol of, for example, of peace. A symbol of purity. A symbol of beauty. A symbol of, for example, innocence. This is the symbolic. It is behind its literal existence or meaning. Objects are often used to symbolize something else. When we have a look at the dove, many things are associated to our minds. These are the symbolic significances so far as meaning and implication are concerned. Symbolism is used to provide more meaning to the writing beyond what is actually being written. Symbolism is used to provide more meaning, additional meanings, to the writing beyond what is actually being written. The French symbolists employed an order of private symbols in poetry of rich suggestiveness rather than apparent signification. This technique had a vigorous influence throughout Europe and in England and America on poets like Arthur Symons, Ernest Dowson, William Butler Yeats, Ezra Pound, Hart Crane, and Wallace Stevens. They are all symbolists. So when you read their poems, you will observe that there are many things that are used for their own symbolic significances in the title and in the content of the poem. Maybe animals, you see, maybe images, maybe even buildings, maybe a reference to humans. They all imply symbolic significances, so they are called symbolists. Number 4, Objectivism. Objectivism is a term referring to a loose-knit group of second generation of modernists who appeared in 1930s in America. Moreover, Objectivism is an American poetic movement that emerged from the Imagist school of poetry in the 1930s, influenced by early modernist poets such as Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and William Carlos Williams. The Objectivist poets utilized free verse, dense, concentrated language, and imagery. However, the Objectivist school of poetry rejected the Imagist interest in classicism and mythology, choosing to focus on ordinary objects and everyday life, a focus reflected in their use small everyday words. They believed in treating the poem as an object, presenting the poet's sincere attempt to look clearly at the world. It reflects the poet's primary interest in composing a structure of relationships apprehensible as a whole, rather than in offering interpretations of experience. The Objectivists also like to use language more literally than figuratively. They produced a considerable diversity of styles and were highly influential for later generations of writers.